While it may not be full-fledged panic mode quite yet for the BYU men's basketball program, Kevin Young and company have a ton of work to do if they want to turn this ship around.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. I'm Jake Hatch, 14-year credentialed media member at BYU, your resident expert and insider, your host here on the show. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And thank you for making all of us fine folks over at Locked On, the #1 sports podcast network. All right, coming up on today's show, BYU basketball. What do Kevin Young and his program, what do they need to do to get things back in the win column? Well, I have a couple of ideas. We'll get into that. One of them particularly that I think would make all of the difference, quite honestly, for this program. We'll get into that. Then we're going to talk about a story that I've been very slow to pick up on, and that is the BYU women's basketball program. Lee Cummard has done an incredible job year one on the job, and we'll need to talk more about it, and we'll get into that. We'll finish up today's show talking about the unique connection between San Clemente, California, and the Brigham University football program. Yes, it's become a pipeline to SoCal. How is it continuing? Well, we'll talk about Preston Beck and Jackson Rex all ahead on today's show. It's all brought to you by our friends over at Mazda. We put that same drive into every detail. When define the moment, putting in the work, that defines you. Stay tuned for highlights in this week's Moving the Game Forward segment. There's more to a Mazda because there's more to you. All right, so the BYU men's basketball program is likely going to drop in the national polls. If they check in somewhere around the 20 mark, I will be mildly surprised, because after back-to-back losses on the road at Kansas this past Saturday, and obviously before that, the loss to #1 Arizona, BYU, as crazy as it may sound, because I think most of us in our minds think of BYU amidst the elite of the Big 12. Well, you know where BYU's at right now in the conference rankings? Let's see. There's a program called UCF that is 6-3 in Big 12 play, and at 5-4, the West Virginia Mountaineers, and situated just between those two, who BYU is obviously thinking, probably a little higher tier that BYU exists on, are the 13th ranked, as of recording this podcast, BYU Cougars at 5-3 in Big 12 play. The teams that I think all of us, yours truly included, believe that BYU kind of exists among are the likes of Arizona, Houston, Iowa State, Kansas, and Texas Tech. Those are the other ranked teams here in the Big 12, but BYU finds itself mired kind of in that middle tier of the Big 12. And if we're being honest with ourselves, is BYU not a middling Big 12 team right now? I'd be hard-pressed to argue that they aren't, because the results speak for themselves. BYU has beaten every team they have been favored against, and something that Robbie McCombs, I believe, if I recall correctly, pointed out. They are 17-4 on the season. All 17 of their wins came as the favorite in that game. The 4 losses, the losses that they're supposed to pick up, the teams they are supposed to lose to. BYU is still searching for a signature win this season. They have had opportunities against #1 Arizona and came up very close on Monday night a week ago. They had a chance against Kansas had they been able to get anything closer than 4 points in that final stanza of those games. But the troubling issue with this BYU basketball team is there is not a consistent 40 minutes out of them that I can think of in Big 12 play in particular, and more importantly, it feels like for long stretches of the entire season. If that's the operative word, if this BYU basketball team is capable of putting together a capable 40 minutes, much like kind of the second halves against both Arizona and Kansas have shown, this is a team that could be one of the elite in the Big 12. But as I have said, the results speak for themselves. The biggest thing I see as the biggest impediment to BYU being an elite team in the Big 12 is their consistency on defense. There are stretches of games where BYU shows their defensive prowess, the capability to lock up opposing teams and make life absolutely miserable for opposing lineups. But then it goes missing for 5, 6, 7 minutes at a time. And much like the first half against Kansas, because it's the most recent game in our mind, they went 9-12 from the 3-point arc in the first half of that game and blew it wide open, a 20-point margin at halftime. And BYU showed that if you dig yourself too deep of a hole, as they have done repeatedly, it's very, very difficult to climb out of said hole, even as close as you might get. Same thing with Arizona. This is a BYU team that I believe a lot of us, I think BYU's got an offensive problem, and there are some concerning numbers on offense, in particular, the bench scoring. The fact that BYU got a grand total of three bench points on Saturday against Kansas. That was the big three late by Hadim Boop. Those are the only bench points BYU got. Yeah, there are issues offensively, but the bigger, more glaring issue is on the defensive side of the basketball. And a lot of us, I've kind of been guilty of this myself, have looked at the offense as being the issue. And like I said, there are issues there, but the offensive numbers actually bear out that BYU is pretty darn consistent with their offense. And so long as they continue to score somewhere in the 80-point range, BYU should win a fair amount of games, if not the majority of the games they play. The problem is they're playing in some of the elite basketball teams. We have seen that this Big 12 conference has got all the makings of having multiple national title contenders. And I think BYU aspires to be mentioned among that elite tier that could realistically hoist a national title come early April of this year. Right now, that team's far from it. But much like last year, I remember coming out of the month of January last year wondering, okay, if this BYU team, what are they going to look like? They were kind of a middling program, much like they are right now. Were they 6-6 at one point and then put together an incredible run, a 9-game win streak down the stretch in the month of February that really got them back on track? Will we see a similar type situation play out here for the BYU basketball program? One can only hope, because if it does, that shows that I think BYU in particular figured out what they're doing on the defensive side of the basketball. The biggest thing you can do with defense is defense travels, and it requires effort. It requires guys to dig in and say, you know what? You're not getting past me. I'm going to block this shot. And then associated with it is not allowing extra possessions. And what that means, extra possessions, is A, rebounding the ball effectively. You have to make sure that they do not get offensive rebounds if at all possible. And B, limiting turnovers. If BYU can do some of these very simple things, like I said, lock down more on the defensive side of the basketball, I believe that this team can really become the force we hope it all can be. But I'll reiterate, the bigger point here is the consistency. It's lacking from this team. We are headed into the final full month of the regular season. Early next month, there's some regular season games, and we call it March Madness for a reason. It is when legends are made in this sport. This month of February that BYU has in front of them, they've got to take full advantage of it and get back on the right track. And that starts Wednesday night out at Gallagher-Iba Arena against Oklahoma State, and then back home on late Saturday night when number 10 Houston comes to town to take on the Cougars. It's the Red Cougars versus the Blue Cougars. And if you want to have BYU fans kind of back on board and feeling good about this team, sweep both games this week. That'd be a ranked win, and obviously a win you're supposed to get at Oklahoma State. But Oklahoma State, they have proven to be pretty frisky themselves. They hope to fight their way onto the NCAA tournament bubble, and a win over BYU would help them do that in a big way. And a third straight loss for BYU, we have to talk ourselves a little bit off of a ledge if you're a BYU basketball a fan. But I think the bigger point to be made here is there are a lot of both positive signs for BYU that point to a team that can really be a force come March. The issue is, can they find the consistency and do what they need to do to become that team I think we all in our heart of hearts hope they can become? Time will ultimately tell that tale, and we'll see how it all shakes out over the next 20 some odd days before March gets here. All right, coming up next, we're going to talk about a program that I admit I have been very slow on the, talking about them is probably the best way to say it. And I'm going to make amends for that coming up next. And that's the other basketball program in Provo, Utah, the BYU women's team. Are they the anti-men's team? And we'll explain what that means next. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Now, it is the final game. It's the final day of football this Sunday. One last kickoff, one final chance to get in on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it all with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing the favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same-game parlay, this is the game everyone's been waiting for. It's where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap feels bigger. It's the perfect way to cap off the season, make the Super Bowl even more exciting from kickoff to the final whistle. So if you're a new customer, bet just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. Simple as that. Make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the football season is officially over. It's one last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So the BYU women's basketball program has been a team that has been kind of just doing their thing off to the side. And I know that on this show, I talk very heavily about two main sports around BYU. Those would be the BYU football program and the BYU men's basketball program. And by and large, much like they are, it is the ecosystem in college sports. Those are the biggest eyeball attractors across most Division I athletic departments. But I cannot ignore any longer what the BYU women's team is doing. If you missed it over the weekend, the BYU women's basketball program beat the University of Utah 77-65. And you may be thinking, well, they probably should have beat Utah, Jake. Well, here's the thing. They actually found themselves in a pretty decent hole themselves at halftime, trailing by 10 points to the Utes. But unlike BYU men's basketball, the women's basketball program found a way out of that hole and ran away with a victory over their rival on their home court. Now, the biggest thing to know about the women's basketball program is they have done this in a way that it's been pretty remarkable. Because remember, last year, Lee Cummard got hired after a pretty, I think, extensive coaching search, but ultimately led them right back to where they probably should have started. And that is hiring Lee, the former BYU men's basketball star himself. And all he has done is create a team that plays in terms of a collective unit, for at least from my vantage point. I can't say that I've watched every BYU women's basketball game this season. In fact, I have not seen the majority of them, but I have kept tabs on them from time to time. And in talking with people around that basketball program, the team is the star identity is kind of what I see as a hallmark of this team. And case in point of that is Brinley Cannon was BYU's leading scorer against Utah on Saturday. A lot of us, yours truly included, believe that Delaney Gibb is the end-all be-all for BYU women's basketball. And while she very much is that, Delaney was actually limited to just 8 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists. So a pretty decent stat line for her, but far from being the absolute end-all be-all that I think most of us believe that she is for BYU women's basketball. It's awesome to have seen Mariah Hudgens, Olivia Hamlin. They have had a ton of contributors for Lee Cummard's squad all season long that have stepped up in big moments and led BYU women's basketball to some big wins. And I think the thing about this is I called them kind of the anti-BYU men's basketball program, where BYU men's basketball seems to be wholly reliant on 3-star players. And I don't blame them for being reliant on those guys. Speaking of Richie Saunders, Rob Wright, and AJ Dybantsa. But the bigger point is BYU women's basketball, they're getting contributions kind of from all over the roster. And it harkens back to the BYU men's basketball program of last year. Remember, that rotation went 11, 12 guys deep. And it seemed like every other game, there was a new name that popped up and contributed an important part of a win for the BYU men's basketball program. That kind of pointed to what this BYU women's team is, at least from my vantage point, is that they are, like, once again, more of a team than anything else. They have put together a pretty stout record overall, 15-5 on the year. They're 5-5 in Big 12 play. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Let's reverse that. 16-6 overall on the season, 5-5 in conference play. I had 5 stuck in my mind. And they're 10-3 at home. They're 4-2 away, 2-1 on neutral court. And all they've done is prove to be a team that I think is a bit of a surprise in the Big 12. Speaking of the women's side of things in the Big 12 conference, they, much like the men's side, have some elite teams, but then a lot of other teams who kind of stuck in like a kind of like mushy middle is probably the best way to say it. But what I like about this BYU women's basketball team is they continue to find ways, even if they suffer tough losses. I think that it was West Virginia. They had 25 turnovers in that loss, number 22 West Virginia, but then they lost to Oklahoma State in disappointing fashion. But all they do is bounce back with a big win over Utah. They're back out on the road this week. Wednesday, they'll be at Kansas, followed by a road game at Kansas State, which are both opportunities for BYU to get back into the win column. But if you've not been paying attention to BYU women's basketball, I'm going to call myself onto the carpet. I want to encourage you guys as well to pay attention to this team. They have proven to be, like I said, more of a team than anything else. And I think that we can appreciate the fact that Lee Cummard, year one, because let's be honest, a lot of programs, when you switch a coach out, you usually need a little bit of a grace period to get things on the right path. But all I have seen from this women's basketball program from Lee Cummard is he took a lot of what he learned, both from working for Jeff Judkins, and has kind of translated it forward to fit the modern game. Because when Juddy went out was kind of the really tail end of what old college basketball was, not a ton of NIL, not a ton of the transfer portal. And then 3-4 years later, now that Lee Cummard is in charge of this program, he has really kind of taken some of those hallmarks of what Juddy's program stood for the better part of 2 decades. And like I said, it's kind of morphed them a little bit, finessed them, because you have to fit that with NIL and transfer portal in this modern age. And he's put together an incredibly competitive squad that deserves more credit than I think others out there in the media have been giving them. So I think this is a team, if you're looking kind of being jaded by the BYU men's basketball program, maybe you want to look across the way and look at the BYU women's team. I can also tell you this. If you go to BYU women's basketball games, you can get far better seats than you can at BYU men's basketball games, because let's just put it this way. Attendance, nowhere near the same. But like I said, the product on the court, pretty awesome, quite honestly, for this BYU women's basketball program. And I really am impressed from what I have seen. And going back and watching that Utah game in particular, it really kind of had the hallmarks of what BYU men's basketball struggled with. Utah came out, shot the ball well, stifled BYU on the defensive side of the ball. And then in the second half, unlike BYU men's basketball, I know that the men's team made a run at it, but the women's team, they made a run and then some, just racing past Utah. And it was a really, really impressive outing in the second half for this women's basketball program to avoid a 3rd straight loss, which is what the men's team is going to try to do this week. But BYU women, they're worth the price of admission. And like I said, if you want to watch a team that is proven to be very, very resilient and has done so seemingly in spite of what a lot of people thought they were going to do this year, because if you look at the preseason projections for BYU women's basketball, they were expected to be, fairly decent, but they were not expected to be where they're at right now. And like I said, in the mix, speaking of the Big 12 conference, pretty gaudy record, and kind of looking on the outside in speaking of the NCAA tournament bubble, but there's no reason to think that down the stretch here, the women's team couldn't fight their way onto that bubble. Like I said, they have got games, the Kansas schools this week, and they'll be back home to face Iowa State, back on the road at Colorado, and then finishing up with a run of home against Cincinnati, road game Utah, road game Arizona State, and then another home game against Colorado. They can make a run here. They can find themselves on the right side of the NCAA tournament bubble, but it's going to require them to, I think, essentially all but win out. And obviously if you make a run in the Big 12 tournament, you could find your way into the big dance that way. But really, this is a team that I really am impressed by, and they have shown a lot of resolve, a lot of fight, a lot of grit, and quite honestly, just a whole lot of want to is probably the best way to say it about what Lee Cummard has implemented with the BYU women's basketball team. And I'll be tracking them much closer down the stretch here, because they very much look like a team that, like the men's team, is fighting for their postseason lives and has the opportunity this month, the month of February. It's kind of that proving ground. If you want to be the team I think we all think you can be, well, go out and prove it. And I think Lee Cummard's got them well positioned for this coming month. All right, coming up next, we'll talk about the football program and a unique connection to one surfing city in Southern California. What is it about San Clemente and BYU? Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Maz's, moving the game forward. For those who show there's just more to the score than what's on the screen. But this week, we are going to highlight Richie Saunders in a game that featured A.J. Dybantsa and Darren Peterson, two of the top two, maybe the top 2 NBA draft picks. Richie just stole the scene. 33 points, 10 rebounds, showing us everything he's capable of. And I think opening the eyeballs even more than they already were when it came to NBA draft people and, NBA talent evaluators all at the same time. These moments, like what Richie did, remind us of what it really takes to raise the bar. It's that extra work off the court, dialing in every detail, giving that extra fire, that grit, and I never quit attitude, which is exactly, I think, what Richie embodies. We put that same passion, speaking of Maz, into every model. Highlights make the real. What it took to get there makes it count, because there's more to a Mazda, because there's more to you. All right, so the BYU football program has done a really good job over the years of creating pipelines. Remember, Lavelle created the BYU to Hawaii and vice versa pipeline for decades when other college football programs ignored the islands, and he brought in just star player after star player after star player from Hawaii. BYU's had strong runs in the Intermountain West, bringing people from Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, etc. California, also a strong pipeline for BYU, and there is another pipeline developing in Southern California, and that is the San Clemente area and BYU in Provo, Utah. Yes, I understand that connection has more to do with, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints than most might want to imagine. But 2 offers went out this past weekend to 2 members of the San Clemente High School football program, and both of them have very familiar last names, but it kind of highlights what BYU is trying to do in this day and age. Obviously, building a football program, it takes, a lot of work when it comes to bringing in guys, developing their talent, honing their craft, and hopefully holding on to them. And that's kind of the hallmark of Kalani Sitake's programs. I've talked about the fact that I think they're fairly portal proof because more often than not, when guys sign with BYU, they know what they're getting into. They know that they stand for more than just being a football player. They stand for being a representative of Brigham Young University. They represent a football program that's associated with the worldwide faith. And I respect all of that. But the fun part is there's also a legacy impact here as well, because if you missed it over the weekend, Jackson Rex and Preston Beck were both offered by the BYU football program, and those 2 last names should sound pretty familiar to any Cougar fan within the sound of my voice, because Jackson Rex, he is one of the sons of the famous BYU tight end Byron Rex. I think Byron is a legend in his own right. Obviously, Isaac and Preston, who's currently at BYU, have both had their moments in Cougar uniforms. In fact, Isaac broke his dad's record for career touchdown receptions by a tight end in BYU football history. Well, Jackson Rex is the next in a long line of Rex family members who figure to be BYU Cougars. Now, Jackson, to be clear, has not committed to BYU, but it's kind of the family school. So no offense to the Rex family, but can you just move along and just announce that Jackson's going to go to BYU? Only being slightly facetious there, but Jackson, much like Preston, a little in terms of smaller than his dad and his older brother Isaac at 6'1", 180 pounds, figures to play either defensive back or maybe wide receiver at the next level. But that is a great legacy to have more Rex family members playing for BYU football, because the Rex family names have been pretty synonymous with excellent football play, and I think Jackson kind of brings that next element of that. Now, the other player that connects San Clemente and BYU is Preston Beck. Now, that last name, you're like, oh, no, it doesn't take long to imagine what this family connection is. Preston Beck is the son of former BYU quarterback John Beck. Now, John obviously went on to have a run in the NFL, and most recently has been essentially a world famous quarterback trainer with 3D QB down in the Southern California area, and does a remarkable job. I can tell you there are a ton of people out there who think that 3D QB and what John does, it's really unmatched in many respects. But his son, chip off the old block. Preston Beck's a class of 2028 quarterback prospect, just picked up an offer from BYU. Also joined offers over the weekend from Colorado State and Nevada. And here's the thing about Preston is, much like his old man, he is a quarterback who knows exactly what he is as a player. If you go and watch Preston Beck's highlights, this is a kid who doesn't try to play outside of himself. And the fact that he's a starting quarterback for San Clemente High School, which has had a ton of good players in recent memory, some of them played at BYU, some of them played at Utah, but it just put guys all over in terms of college football. To be a starting quarterback of a program that caliber shows what Preston Beck has in him. He's listed at 6'1", $170 right now, and only figures to get bigger as his high school career goes on. But what I love about Preston is you watch his highlight reel, and it's like, yeah, I see shades of John Beck in there. My biggest question is he going to have the same type of arm that John had? Because I'm telling you, John Beck had one of the strongest arms in BYU football history, and this is a program that's been blessed with a lot of guys with some strong arms. But I don't think you have to look much further than John Beck, that famous throw against Utah, him jumping up in the air, fading away, and slinging a rock from almost at the opposite sideline to the far hash, roughly like 30 yards downfield, to drop it into the hands of a kneeling Johnny Harleen. That's an incredible throw. And we'll see if Preston has that same type of arm in time, but already shows the ability to make the throws necessary, because his stats don't argue. They speak for themselves here, because let me, if I can pull this up here and get the right stats here. 1,450 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions after being a starting quarterback for part of the season for San Clemente High School. Pretty solid numbers. And once again, he's being tuteled. Is that tutelage? Tuteled? He's being tuteled by one of the preeminent quarterback whisperers of our modern age, and it just so happens that it's his dad, John Beck. So the San Clemente pipeline to BYU continues to be very, very strong. And so long as there are Rex family members, Beck family members, and who else knows what other talented players may come up through the San Clemente system, the Tritons, I think that's what they're called. I think they're the Tritons, are going to continue to be an absolute force for BYU football to recruit from, because I love the fact that they just go out and play a really strong football. And it doesn't hurt, like I said, to have guys like this who have family connections to BYU or legacy players that they can come out and play a really, really strong football. And so long as they continue to produce at that level, I think that BYU is going to continue to recruit this program very, very heavily. And I also kind of just think back. I think a number, that I really like recruiting. It's just kind of one of those things I've enjoyed all my years growing up. I can think back to the very early days when recruiting services were just getting started. We're talking the late 90s, early 2000s. And then there was this quarterback by the name of John Beck coming out of Mesa Mountain View High School in Arizona. And I was like, oh, this is intriguing. A guy who played at a program that's won at a high level. Speaking of Mesa Mountain View down there in Arizona, the Toros, as their nickname is known, and was just a really incredible quarterback. And then John came to BYU because he's a BYU guy. That's the one thing I knew about John, and went through a ton of struggles. Remember, he got lambasted for crying after a game at one point, had multiple moments where it felt like maybe his career was never going to take off at BYU. And then, as fate would have it, the 2006 season, where 2005 and 2006 took place. And man, John has become one of the more recent legends of BYU football. And if Preston can be anything like his dad, let's say he does pick BYU, because much like Jackson, he's not committed quite yet. But if Preston can have a similar type career at BYU, we're in for a fun one, folks. So I love this connection BYU's developed with San Clemente High School. It's awesome to see guys like Jackson Rex and Preston Beck getting their opportunity, because A, it carries on strong family legacies at that high school in particular. B, the legacy that it brings to BYU. And C, just another connection that BYU has to Southern California, which has got to be still. I don't care that BYU's no longer playing as many games in Southern California or California in general, being a member of the Big 12 Conference. California still needs to be one of the recruiting hotbeds BYU taps into. It's imperative. A lot of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints down there, obviously, but you've got to tap into that market, because it is one of the more talent-rich areas in all of the country when it comes to high school, college football player types. And I know guys like Aaron Roderick are doing a great job down there. I know Gennaro Guilford did that once upon a time. He did a great job, particularly in LA County. But I think BYU, they continue to keep those recruiting ties strong in Southern California. It only makes BYU football that much better, and thereby, ensures that we're still going to be able to watch some high-level football in Provo, Utah for years to come. All right, that's going to do it for this Monday edition of the show. Hope you guys are all doing fantastic out there, wherever you might be. If you want more inside, in-depth content like this, make sure you join the Locked On Cougars Everydayer Club. Go to lockedoncougars.supercast.com. That's lockedoncougars.supercast.com, or there's a link in the show notes below if you want to check it out that way. And as always, please continue to subscribe, rate, and review. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a little thumbs up icon right there. Click it. Let us know what you like about the show with a comment or two in the comment section. If you're if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, leave us a rating and review. Always want those 5-star ratings, because obviously it helps us build this audience. But I'll just sign off by saying, as we often do, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Now go make your second listen of the day, Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin. He's doing a great job covering the sport that we love. And we will catch you guys right back here tomorrow as Everydayers right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.